are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
It just took, a few years to say, okay, what does it mean to actually be a network that is multidenominational? It's not just like the Pentecostals who like our theology. Can we have something deep-rooted enough that can have really wide branches and people bring who they are? Our Anabaptists don't have to be less Anabaptist to be at this table. They don't have to become a different tradition. This table begins to be something that integrates the beauty of all these different parts of the body of Christ. I think 8 years ago, I moved into that role, and probably like the last 4 or 5 years, the team and what it is now feels very much this shared vision that has grown out of, probably 7 or 8 or 9 different apostolic leaders in our city. Right. There's this beautiful expression of a lot of different leaders bringing a lot of their best gifts to try to see a citywide church movement happen together.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other as we celebrate Women's History Month. In today's episode, our host, Jay Pathak, talks to Dennae Pierre, author and co-director of City to City North America, the Crete Collective, and the Search Network. Let's listen in.
Thanks, Dennae, for joining us on our podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
When did we first meet? I was trying to piece that together.
Was it in Italy? I think that
I think it was before that.
Maybe. It might have been a Phoenix event. Like you might have been visiting some friends in town.
I think it was in the city movement stuff somewhere.
Yeah. Waterhouse, were you part of that?
No, I wasn't cool enough. I wasn't cool enough to be involved. Yeah. I wasn't in on that, but I'd known Tyler.
Yeah.
And then I think we had done some city things. So I'd been down there in Phoenix with some of the folks. So I think it might have been one of those city, but we didn't have a real conversation. And then it was in Rome.
Yes.
We got to know one another. Look at how cool we sound already.
I know, right?
We're talking about being in Rome. Anyway, we sound way cooler than we are. But you've not heard this podcast, so basically it's storytelling and then trying to I find you to be really one of the most interesting leaders I know, like anywhere. I bring up your name a lot, so I'm super excited to get to introduce you to my friends and have my friends get to know you. But we'll start where all stories begin, which is tell me about where you were born and where you grew up.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. So West Phoenix there's an area called El Mirage, which went to a one-room Christian schoolhouse in El Mirage, which was predominantly a immigrant community, low-income school. But then the neighborhood that I was in was a really sweet neighborhood. My grandparents and my aunt and all kinds of family lived within a couple miles of each other. So I had a really...
Wow. So multi-generational.
Yep. My grandparents, I either lived with them or they lived with us for different seasons of life. And my cousins, we kind of we would kind of swap houses, kind of grew up with cousins as sisters, go back and forth between each other's houses. And
wow. And so your grandparents grew up, did they grow up in Phoenix or were they once immigrated?
My mom immigrated from Honduras and initially ended up in the East Coast in Rhode Island. And then when she finished high school, my grandfather moved to Phoenix from Rhode Island. So he'd watched a lot of John Wayne in Honduras and had this idea of being like a cowboy in the West.
This is incredible.
Right? And so as soon as he was able to move the family out here, he moved, and then he had 3 daughters, and they all came with him as in their early 20s. So by the time me and all my cousins were born, we were all, in this part of Phoenix together. And he had a motorcycle was his horse. And he totally had the gun on his hip and would go out shooting and cowboy boots, the big buckle, not like Texas cowboy. It was definitely Central American meets John Wayne kind of cowboy.
And so in other words, it isn't like there's a Honduran population. And he was just like, I'm doing this.
Totally. Well, he was enamored with the desert, the West, loved the desert.
Isn't it incredible to think about how these things, so now generations of people are in this city because one guy is like John Wayne,
That's right. Yeah.
That is incredible. And what did he do for a living? What made it so he could?
So he made parts for airplanes. So some kind of factory job was what he had. And so I don't know how he got into that or how he ended up out here, but and then I would say that most of the community we were living in, I think most of the immigrants in this part of Phoenix are from Mexico. It's a lot of Mexican immigrants, which even that was, there was such even that was interesting, like being a Central American family, but more kind of that next generation. And then you're in a community with a lot of first generation Mexican families.
Right.
And and both a lot of his what's it, maybe resonating with the community, and also a lot, maybe some like unhelpful pride of like where, he was, so much more John Wayne-ish.
Right. Well, and so did you grow up? I mean, this is just a curiosity. So when you're growing up, I would imagine people just assume you're Mexican.
Yeah. My grandfather for sure. So I remember even like young, him getting like cursed out for people assuming he was illegal.
Right.
Getting pulled over, things like that. My dad is from Rhode Island. Like they can trace their family back to the Mayflower. So, so my cousins and I are kind of all, a whole array of.
Yeah, just all mixed up.
All mixed up,
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's so interesting. Okay. So then you said you were in a one-room schoolhouse that was Christian. So that means there was some kind of church thing happening all the way through.
Yeah, I would say really young. I don't remember ever not being in church. My grandmother she went to some kind of bilingual Pentecostal. So she was Catholic, had some kind of Holy Spirit encounter in the whole Jesus movement, whatever was happening then.
Oh, really? Huh.
And I have two of my great tias are nuns, retired nuns now. So it was a strong Catholic family in Honduras and then in Rhode Island when they immigrated to Rhode Island. And then they had this Pentecostal experience in the 70s, right when they moved to Arizona in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I would go to her church quite a bit. My grandpa had no faith, was very turned off by religion. And then my dad's family would go to this, like, my dad had a lot of like, I don't know, probably some kind of like fundamentalistic Baptist Bible-y church type background. So I grew up going to a few different contexts and really noticing, I remember really young noticing the difference between worship, tradition, but then cultures. There was kind of white evangelical church. I wouldn't have called it that,
right?
But kind of this way of engaging scripture and Bible teaching and worship. And then you had the kind of Pentecostal Spanish-speaking worship that was very, very different. So yeah, I remember noticing pretty early on that there's distinction, and these groups don't necessarily see my Hispanic family the same as equal. Like it was like clear that kind of like this group is kind of perceived as being less educated, less mobile, those kind of things.
And was there also then the Catholic thread? Like was that like we would go to this or that thing or?
Yeah, my great aunts were mostly we'd see them when they came in town to visit, or they were still in Honduras or in Rhode Island. So more just kind of like they were my grandfather's sisters, and he was just very proud of them.
Right.
Kind of their mercy minister. So I grew up hearing a lot about the work that they did with the poor and kind of their kind of devout faith. So they were his big sisters, and he had a lot of respect for them. And so, I don't know that I quite had too much overlap in the Catholic Church beyond just a strong awareness that this was part of our family heritage.
And it was, so by and large, church was positive.
Yes, actually, church was probably the place that I felt the most secure and safe and just joy. So, in either at my grandfather's house, so we would be at his house as much as possible. And when he wasn't working, which he was a very hard worker, but any kind of like Friday afternoon, all weekend long, he just loved kids. So all the grandkids were with Papa, and we did all kinds of things with him. So he was a really sweet part of our childhood. And then church would be the other part, where there was a lot of chaos in our family and in our life. and kind of Wednesday night Bible study, VBS, Sunday morning, Sunday night. It's like the more you could be there, the more kind of like that was kind of where like the structure and like chocolate chip cookies and the candy and the fun, the fun was. And so pretty young, I remember like a strong draw to be as much a part of local church as possible. Definitely had, going in up through elementary school, later elementary school, began noticing lots of the, just challenges as a family. Maybe went through a divorce, and a friend of mine, parents are now being kind of shunned by the community. So began noticing again, like, oh wow, there's things here that aren't congruent with what seems right and righteous, but also, had always felt a strong pull towards being part of and serving in church.
So that sort of church story runs all the way through high school.
Yeah. So my family, I'm laughing because my family had this definitely a pattern. Of course, you notice these patterns in hindsight, but there would probably be every like 3 to 4 years that my parents would be part of some kind of like church split or church fracture, or just they were kind of being sent out and going to be part of a different church. Not sent out with a blessing. Right. Being what do you call it? I don't know what the word is.
It's a splant. It's a splant is what I've always heard. Splant.
Yeah. Right. And so they would be kind of, I would end up finding myself really connected to leaders, pastors, and then there would be this friction. And then we'd be kind of looking for a church. And probably around, I think 6th grade was the first time that I began looking for my own church. So I remember at 6th grade, and then again in 8th grade, started walking. And actually in 8th grade, I found a new church. Our family had moved at that point to a new neighborhood, quite a bit away from my grandparents. So that was a huge kind of disruptive moment in our life. And so we're now 20 minutes away from my grandparents and my whole neighborhood with all my cousins in it. And we're in this kind of middle class, wealthy suburban neighborhood. And my parents were back to like no longer being part of whatever church we had been part of. And so I think I found a church and like walked in. There was a church receptionist there, and I asked to meet with the pastors. And
oh my gosh, you're in 8th grade?
8th grade. Yeah. 8th grade.
Wow.
Actually, right before my 8th grade year started. So that I think there was just there's something that always felt like I can be developed in these places. I can kind of be, I always felt seen, really just, I don't know. It felt kind of like a stabilizing factor in kind of a chaotic life.
Wow. Yeah. Because it sounds like, I'm sure there's any number of stories to be told about why are your parents bouncing around churches? Why are they a part of different splants and messes? And then, hey, we're going to be away from family now. That was probably a big deal, I imagine, given you're talking about the closeness.
Yeah.
So something in all of that made you say, you know what, I got to make some decisions here. I got to figure out what I'm going to do in the middle of all this as a 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think early elementary school, I feel like God I always had a sense of like I'm in chaos. Like it felt chaotic. I even find like school papers you write, like writing prompts and writing a lot about the chaos of our home. And then because of these like every 3 to 5 year jumps in our church, that was also always, you don't just have those things happen without lots of communal chaos, right? This communal chaos where it's like, oh, we can't talk to these people and those people aren't allowed at our house anymore. Just that kind of dual parallel layers of chaos. But really, I mean, I think 3rd grade, it's hard to remember 100%, but I think as much as early as 3rd grade, really still broken reading in terms of my reading capacity, just falling in love with scripture and, stumbling through, Proverbs or Psalms or gospel stories, and as much as you can kind of digest some of those more narratives, and feeling so drawn to a like experience with Christ in Scripture, but also feeling so confused by whatever. And who knows? I was probably reading like the King James version or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's adults that read the Bible that can't figure out what's going on. So, like,
right?
I mean,
so I remember just always having so many questions and like wanting to understand, and so I think there was this even in that chaos, a real sense of safety in Christ, like viscerally, and then in Christian, like in the church, even where there was challenges or dysfunction, a sense that, okay, but these people are like reading the same book. Like these people are following the same, path that I am, and really drawn to, the curiosity piece of what does that mean? What does that look like? And then you go into high school and now you're like really putting things together and you're like, whoa, there is so much hypocrisy. Then my whole prophet came out, right? Then it's like, wait a minute, the Gospels say this and the Beatitudes say this, and we're doing that, Then I think that's when it began to be more probably putting things together and things feeling really incongruent from what we say we believe versus who we are.
But none of that, at least in high school, still made you go, this is just a joke.
Yeah. No.
None of this is real. I'm out.
If anything, I'm sure I was like the obnoxious youth group member who's like,
right,
arguing with the adults, I'm
Dude,
sure.
I love it. I love it. But, and I think when I hear your story, I have a similar experience in that I'm always a little unsure of how to relate to the sort of deconstructing types. Because for me, so much of my life was disordered and unclear.
Yeah.
That what coming into life with Jesus and then being in this thing called the church provided me was at least a skeleton of like what life could be like.
Absolutely.
So however messed up it was, it at least was trying to do something that was coherent. And it seemed to have a vision of humanity that was hopeful compared to what? Compared to nothing. And so what's so interesting is how many kids that were raised in church often take that for granted. So they find so much of their work is like deconstructing everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas I was like, what? I mean, if I deconstruct this, what is there? There's this, I mean, I can challenge it and I want to try to live congruently. That was a good word you used, or with integrity. And so in the middle of all of this, I don't know enough about your brothers and sisters, but I'm sure there's any number. It sounds like there's this extended family everywhere. And I'm sure each one of them, as tends to be the case and mess, are all coping with that in the ways they know how. So who knows? I'm sure there's 100 ways that's working. They're not all taking the Dennae prophet, youth group fighter route. I imagine they're medicating and managing in any number of ways.
Yeah.
But in the midst of that, when did you start to say, I think maybe I'm a leader. I might have some calling. I have like a way I'm supposed to stand in the middle of this that looks different than other people. Did that just ever occur to you? Or were you just like, I don't know, I'm just doing this? Or was there a time when somebody looked at you and said, hey, you might not know this, but this is who you are? When did that dawn on you?
I think two ways. Probably in a more broken way. I think in my memory, I was always like a decade older than I actually was. Right? So when I was 8, I was like in my head, I'm like, oh no, I was 16, like physically. I wasn't. So I do think when you're in kind of those family patterns with so much chaos and brokenness, I was the first sister, oldest cousin. I was kind of the protector and like the make sure there's dinner, make sure there's kids.
So you were taking a parent role.
Yeah, kind of that parentified and even the arbitrator of challenges. So I think that skill that I think I had a lot of pride in and have had to kind of be like, okay, that was survival. That wasn't necessarily leadership. But I do think it also activated a part of how God did make me in ways that by the time I got to middle school, I even remember like 4th, 5th grade teachers calling my parents in to be like, Dennae's flunking out of, like, she's going to fail. She's not done 30 of the last 32 homework assignments.
Wow.
But she's a leader. I mean, it's like I kept getting passed because they liked me.
Yeah, they can see, well, and they can see the talent that lives in you, right?
So I felt like I think even in middle school, I was eating lunch with teachers. I was kind of annoyed with my peers. And
I love it.
I was like, I'll eat with the teacher and the principal and talk about like politics. Like, yeah, total nerd.
I love it.
So by youth group, by the time that church, I knocked on the door of that pastor, like, I think within a week was letting me babysit his kids. And then I think it was kind of when you get into that space, there was just always this, hey, come join our family. And there was definitely, I think, such a longing to belong that if someone would kind of receive me, I'm like, okay, I'm all in. Like, if you actually invite me to be part of your family, I'll be at your Thanksgiving dinners. Like, come show, I'm rolling up. So I do think there was just that my middle school and high school, both at that point, I was in another Christian school that was larger. And there was a history teacher there who really early on was like, you're a natural leader, invited me into some like leadership development processes. And then youth group, there was, I think right away I was getting pulled into the older groups of leadership development. So it definitely felt like there was a lot of pathways for it and a lot of opportunities to experiment. So, I think 7th grade, and especially when you're kind of in more of depending on your church tradition, this wouldn't happen. But in those churches, it was like, oh, you're a leader. Like, why don't you try to preach your first sermon as like a 7th grader?
Right.
So there was also opportunity to do things I never would have in other, and maybe other churches I wouldn't have had the experience to do. Yeah. So, but it stretched me. I think it probably though. Yeah, I don't know that I actually really began to kind of think through like vocationally, what does it mean to want to do like leadership? Probably till like later in my like early and probably in my 20s when it began to be more solidified. Like actually, this is something that actually I really enjoy. There's a challenge to it, but the challenge is also part of what I kind of feel wired for in some ways.
Well, and one of the blessings and curses of being responsible young is you're not reflecting a lot on the things you're swallowing up. You're just swallowing up gaps and you're just doing what's in front of you. So you're not reflecting on that. Like, this is unusual. I'm doing a thing other people aren't doing. I wonder what that means. You're just like, I don't know. I'm just doing this. And then next thing you know, you're doing that in your church system. And next thing you know, you're doing that at school. And the next thing you're doing, you just start to get into the sort of mode of swallowing up responsibility. Yeah. And one day in your 20s, you're like, I wonder what this means. Like, is this a career? Did I just end up here? Like, what does this mean? Yeah, that's pretty common.
And probably also where I paused, where I'm like, was it leadership? Because I think also in it was more like noticing gaps.
That's right.
And being like, oh, here's a gap. Let's fill that.
Yep.
And actually realizing later as you begin to, as almost a sense of like, oh, I experientially know the world's broken and I want to help repair it or help it be, I want the world to be the way it's supposed to be. And I think there's an intensity or an anxiety that kind of drives that. Yeah. That I don't know if that's leadership, but I think it can turn into leadership or it can be developed long term. So I think in those spaces, people would say I was a leader. But I'm like, no, there's people drowning in the pool. Someone's got to jump. Yeah. That's not leadership. That's like someone can't let those kids drown. And that's probably more of an angst and a like, that's why I use the word prophetic, where it was more, this can't be. We can't have things happen this way. It began to feel more like leadership, I think, when I started to be able to start using that energy to create and to start. And
it was less reactive. Right.
Yeah. When it became more proactive. Yeah. That's probably when I began to discover, oh, this is actually similar muscles, but feels way more fun to be creating and building versus like putting out fires,
Well, and there's all kinds of folks that point out how much of ministry is birthed out of dysfunction or reactivity, right?
Yeah. Right.
Like, that's just part of it. That's part of the story, that you find yourself sort of being fitted to the task almost unconsciously and reactively. But there is a tipping point at some point where you realize, wait a minute, I think I'm doing this because I feel like I have to, or because I'm upset about it, or I'm angry or hurt, or I didn't even realize I was doing this. I just do this. I end up being around the most broken people around me, for example, or I end up swallowing up responsibility in the gaps. Somewhere in there, God comes along in your own healing journey and says, do you want to do this? Like, what if we made you the kind of person that was equipped to do this proactively, not just reactively, and out of strength, not out of fear or anger or worry or hurry. Like, there's a way to do this out of peace and wisdom, but those things tend to come a decent amount later. I mean, I think. And so when you come in out of high school, what are you thinking you're going to do? You graduate, you're not exactly like academic driven person. So you're like, I don't know, I guess I'm supposed to do something now.
Yeah, in high school, there was a woman who was an Assemblies of God missionary, and their whole thing is every 6 years, I think, they come back and they have to go preach at all the churches that give them $100.
Oh, yeah. Slideshow of some kind, usually.
Like 40 different churches in their district.
Right.
And kind of following the theme of attaching myself to people who seemed like older or healthy or just, I've always kind of just aggressively pursued mentors in my life. I can't remember how it happened, but I think the first Sunday she was at our church and I was like, hey, can I just come with you? She was single in her mid 40s. Can I just come with you all summer and follow you around and hold your little slideshow box? And so I got to see the same presentation. She was helping church planters in Jordan. And that was the first time I was like, oh, I want to do that. And I want to be anywhere but Phoenix. So that's when my prayer was like, okay, God, like send me anywhere. I'll go with it wherever you want. I'm reading like all this, what were those missions conferences back in those? Oh, I can't even remember. But like the Passion, it's like, I'll go die missionary in the Middle East. Like send me to the most radical place, whatever.
Did you ever read Jackie Pullinger, Chasing the Dragon? Did you ever see her stuff?
Yes. All that stuff.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So I'm like, I'll go wherever. So just get me out of Phoenix. That was right. I'm wrapping up with, which is funny, right? By the time I'm wrapping up high school, I'm like, just get me as far away from this place. And and the city really had always represented division and hypocrisy to me. And so I was like, I just don't want to be here. So that I went into Bible college, an Assemblies of God Bible college, and by my third year, began looking at. I had a friend who had married a Tanzanian church planter who was working. She had started an orphanage. She was American. The Tanzanian was working with all these tribes planting churches, and so I was going to go spend my last year with her and her family
in Tanzania.
In Tanzania. Yeah.
Wow. So wait, so you go to Bible college and you're just getting like a Bible degree or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you're like, man, I'm just going to go to Tanzania for this year.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I was going to do language school. And I was thinking of going, they kind of had this, like, you have to come for a year, do language school, and we'll just, or come for 6 months and we'll decide to offer you a 3 to 5 year role where you can kind of, if you're fit with the team, you can go back and raise money and then come back. So the year leading up to that, I had started asking. I was a leader at I was the children's pastor at our church.
Okay, wait, that's a small detail. Hold on. So while you're in Bible college, you're pastoring in the church. You're 20.
Oh no, I think 19. I think I started at this church at 19, maybe 18. By 19, they hired me as a children's pastor. And I think by like 20, I'm like running the youth group and children's ministry.
You're like, here's an idea. We will get a child to be the children's pastor.
Absolutely.
And we'll get a youth to be the youth pastor. It's going to be great. What could go wrong?
It went perfect, as you could imagine. Nobody's in jail.
Just total chaos. But I mean, what it demonstrates is, man, you're the kind of person that you're like, hey, I'll just do the thing, and boop, you're in.
Yeah.
And then now you're like, I think I'll go to Tanzania.
Well, what happened was
this is incredible.
I'm in Bible college. I'm working at this church. Next door, I'm working at Starbucks and paying my way through school.
Yeah, because you're the pastor, of children's ministry, but you're not paid.
Or it's like $100 a month or whatever, for this full-time job,
This is perfect. Yeah.
And the church, and so the Starbucks next door, my first few months, this woman, a girl my age, has this recommitment to Christ, just as we're like talking about Jesus and life.
Wow.
And then we had this like little mini revival moment where 6 of our coworkers, we were like shutting down the store, cleaning up, and doing Bible studies and prayer.
So great.
In the office. And so six different women come to faith, or at least wanting to come to church. And I bring one of the coworkers with me to my new church, and she looks like a lesbian. I think she's bisexual. And this old school Assemblies of God pastor from Biloxi, Mississippi is like, you're not welcome here. We don't find here. Right. And this has probably been going back to like even my grandfather not ever wanting to be at church because he always felt excluded. He would always mention the racism for him, it was the Catholic Church in Rhode Island. And so I think because that's so young, I was aware of how people felt like outsiders.
Right.
That was always my theme of like how to help create this I wouldn't use the word inclusion, but this you know what I mean by that word, just a welcoming space where anyone could come and feel like they belonged. And so that happened. I think I was probably at that point had just discovered some like theology books because it was a Pentecostal church that didn't have a lot of theological development.
Right. And
that was what was so interesting, and is I still feel very much tied to. I still very much consider myself Pentecostal.
Right.
But at that point, I was beginning to have all this theological hunger, and there was no formation. Even the Bible college, there was no. It was like very thin.
Wow.
And so at that point, the church said, "Hey, it seems like God's doing something really cool with Starbucks, and and you're asking a lot of questions about the Bible. Why don't you go try to find a church that will support you? I don't know if you're going to want to be long-term Assemblies of God. Why don't you go?"
That's somewhat self-aware.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
And they offered to keep paying me my $100 a month. The whole time I was looking for a church that could someday send me.
Wow.
So that's how I actually ended up at helping what's now my church where I met my husband. I ended up in that core team that was planting 17 years ago, I guess, 17, 18 years ago. And got connected. So my friends, a lot of them got baptized while I was in Tanzania. And so they were kind of the core team of this church plant.
Wow.
So it's really sweet. And then I went to Tanzania and was planning on coming back to raise money. And my first Sunday back, my now husband, who was planting a church, he had planted with another pastor 20 years older than him, because my husband was single. So they didn't want to send him out alone. But then the pastor who planted with him, his wife died in the first few months of the church plant. So you had these two single guys planting this church. I had been involved in the core team, left, came back. I think before I got a chance to meet too many more people in the church, my husband asked me out, and we ended up getting married. And I was like 22 at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
It was just like this. It was crazy. It was crazy.
So then no more Tanzania.
Then no more Tanzania. And then here I am in Phoenix 15 years later.
Wow. So, and then you're sort of growing up in this church plant.
Yes.
But you still don't have like a clear career path.
Yeah. Well, so that was another. So
it's like, now what?
So I came back. This church I loved. It was super evangelistic. They welcomed all these amazing friends in. And this is kind of like early in the church planting. I wouldn't say it was like early in the early days when there was a lot of activity beginning to happen around church planting. So I loved the community. My husband's African American. The vision was a multiethnic church centered on reconciliation and these different things in our city. At that time, downtown Phoenix was a really distressed community. So there was a lot of emphasis on the margin. So there's all these things I loved, but there was no pathway for female leadership, at least in terms of ordination and preaching. And so it was this huge, when my husband and I were dating, it was this, and probably, the first 7 years of our marriage, it was like, how are we going to like reconcile? And there's always, my husband was always very honoring, and he'd gone to seminary with egalitarian pastors and had friends, but he was like very honoring. There's never a doubt or question that there was calling. But what does a pathway look like? And I think at that stage, I'm like, well, I'll just create my own pathway and titles don't matter. And as long as I can do that. So I ended up, starting some community development mission around our local church that's still going today. So kind of beginning just to create missional type projects out of our church. And then my paid job was I got involved in domestic violence shelters locally and began working as like an advocate and a social worker, which eventually led to starting these different nonprofits with birth moms whose kids were in the foster care system. And that whole time, though, there was this team of men and women, no women, men who were planting churches in the city, wanting to be missional. And I would go here and there with my husband to these gatherings and meet his pastor friends and planters. And initially it was, okay, let me work with them around foster care or different ways I can help them collaborate. But there was always this, my husband and I were really praying a ton through, like, what do we do? We're in this structure and my husband's in this tradition that does have a lot of limits around women. And we're in this network that's a bunch of Reformed Baptist men, a couple Presbyterians, but it was like this very, and I'm like, and here I am, this Latina Pentecostal who wants to preach once in a while. You're like, how do you reconcile all that? So so there was just this whole, journey probably for a good 10 years, all through my 20s and early 30s of like, what does it mean to honor this calling? I have such a bent towards justice, but felt like the burden for justice and equity felt any steps I would take there felt to unravel this longing I had for reconciliation and union. And so I'm like, these things, they're not incongruent, but they're not necessarily, one is not always a pathway to the other.
Right.
How do you figure out how to integrate all these things? And so, that really was, I think probably only in the last 5 or 6 years, maybe 7, has it really begun to make sense to me in terms of how do we integrate all these things together.
Yeah.
But it definitely sent me on this wandering journey of, how to be faithful and.
Well, I'd say.
Yeah.
So then somewhere in there, you're doing all of the work in the city, different kinds of advocacy, ways of behaving. And then somewhere in there, this thing called Surge sort of forms, and you're sort of in the mix of that through the different ways you're connecting. And then there's a big shift where it's like, hey, you're going to now lead this and be on staff that. So talk a little about what Surge is and how it came to be and what it means that you lead that, given all the other constraints you're describing. It's not, there's a lot of little, components in that. Yeah.
So 15 to 17 years ago, somewhere in there, several pastors at churches in the city. And early on, my husband and our church was one of those, what we call anchor churches, began to say, hey, what does it look like to dream about a citywide church? What would that mean? And some of those churches ended up actually becoming kind of a one church model. And others, like my husband and some of maybe 3 or 4 other churches, were as much part of that core, but distinct. And we began to say, okay, this group collection of maybe 10 to 15 congregations, let's begin to do leadership development together. And let's create something called Surge School, which quickly became, there's a pastor in town called Tyler Johnson, who really was like, how do we activate laity for mission in our city? And so Surge School became this discipleship program to help activate, that pastors could use to try to help their church members shift their paradigm in terms of mission, even like more holistic gospel.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be kingdom people? And so that was a core in our city. And there was a lot of pastors under 40, even under 30, there was a lot of energy that was happening. Probably year 6 or 7 of Surge, it began to have some Assemblies of God churches and some traditions outside of that original core. And they began to say, oh, this is actually not, that what we're developing is not, it is deeply theological, but it's not niche theology. It's kingdom theology. And so people who want to have this deeper formation from these different traditions can all be part of this. Simultaneously, so our church was part of it, and we were seeing fruit of it in our congregation. But there was also this growing foster care movement that I had been involved in helping lead and design the programming of, that put me into close friendship. My husband and I had become close friends with Tyler Johnson. And Surge was starting a seminary. And that's when, I think like the first cohort was almost all lead pastors, mostly of these redemption churches and a few others. And I'm like, hey, I think I'm ready to go back to school. So here I am. It's like Dennae and I think 13 other white lead pastors from Reformed backgrounds. And that was like my 4-year theological formation.
Wow.
In Mike Goheen's living room. I had begun sharing with Tyler, and my husband and I began praying about, Phoenix, it's not just that we were in a structure, like even our egalitarian churches, we don't have a lot of female ministers in Arizona. And I don't fully know why that is. But it's like, even in the East Coast, even where they might not ordain women, there's still substantial female leadership.
Right.
And so we were hitting these walls in our local church. We were hitting these walls in the city. My husband and I were kind of praying through, what does it mean to be faithful to this shared calling that we both have? And that's when Tyler was like, well, Dennae, would you ever consider, Surge has grown beyond what 6 or 7 pastors can do in our free time. Like, would you consider coming in and leading and taking over? And I realized, I think Tyler and I were in sync of what that meant. I think that the rest of the room thought I was taking over Surge School, which is a discipleship program that needed some administration. So I think our whole first couple of years was even just getting through this whole idea of Dennae is leading. Like, we've hired her, we've turned over the leadership. And what's interesting about a lot of city movements, and are you going to interview Tyler at some point on this podcast?
I'd love to. I mean, he's my friend, so yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah.
So Tyler is this apostolic leader in the city, and in other cities, that type of person hires an operations director. They stay the leader, and they hire someone to do the rest of the stuff, or to run the day-to-day. And there was just from the moment Tyler and I talked about it, it was like, I want you to take and run and lead this. And also maybe it was very clear that I'm not a very good I have very little administrative bones in my body. And there was just this like transfer of leadership and ownership. And so that was really beautiful. And then it just took a few years to say, okay, what does it mean to actually be a network that is multidenominational and that it's not just like the Pentecostals who like our theology. It's like, can we have something deep rooted enough that can have really wide branches, and people can bring who they are? Our Anabaptists don't have to be less Anabaptist to be at this table. They don't have to become a different tradition, but this table begins to be something that integrates the beauty of all these different parts of the body of Christ. And so I think 8 years ago, I moved into that role, and probably like I think for the last 4 or 5 years, the team and what it is now feels very much this shared vision that has grown out of, probably 7 or 8 or 9 different apostolic leaders in our city. Right. There's this beautiful expression of a lot of different leaders bringing a lot of their best gifts to try to see a citywide church movement happen together.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Making All Things New, at Ridgecrest Conference Center just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, from Monday, July 31st to Thursday, August 3rd. We're creating an experience that'll be great for the entire family, adults, teenagers, and kids, as we focus on evangelism, church planting, and global missions. Registration opens to the public on February 8th with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today. See you on the mountain.
Well, and I know, just because I'm around the city movement conversations around the country, different other city movement leaders started to notice Phoenix for the sort of way it's formed around theological convictions, around kind of a discipleship's, framework.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of other city movements form around prayer or this or that initiative that we kind of, we have a crisis that we want to sort of rally around, or maybe even a church planting vision, like, hey, we want to plant a bunch of churches, and so we should probably work together, all of which are fine.
Yeah.
But they all have, every organism has different diseases it's prone to. But, I started to notice, because I'd known you guys and watching what you were doing, and I started to notice, wow, like Tim Keller's folks are suddenly paying attention to what's happening in Phoenix, and the folks up in Portland are starting to pay attention. Of course, I have been in Denver because I love you guys as friends. And so because most people aren't going to know what we're talking about here. Like, what is the scope of Surge right now? So like, how many pastors are like, I'm in for that?
So we have 27 teams.
Mm-hmm.
And those teams are all made up of 3 to 5 churches. Mm-hmm. So there might be one pastor or 5 from that church that are working together around, whether it's a network. So we have all kinds of different affinity networks, like church planting or Spanish-speaking churches or international diaspora churches. So there's all these different networks happening. And then there's initiatives that are collaborative projects. And then there's formational. Some of those teams are the leadership teams for the formation pathway. So Surge School or Neighbors Table, or how do we keep creating resources for leaders? And I think with Surge too, the vision has never been, let's get a bunch of pastors together, but it's really been missional friendship is the best way I know how to describe it. Of like, how do we gather for the sake of pushing resources, decisions, innovations to the laity in Phoenix. So we recognize clergy can be a huge barrier to unleashing God's people, and that there is a need for there to be equipping and care for laity, but unto mission, right? And so we don't have to be the drivers or the designers or the owners of it, but we want to create some trellises where that can happen. And so that's probably where at this point, we're 15 years in. I think our prayer is the next 5 years is that we would now, there's, I think 124 churches involved pretty substantially.
Wow.
There's probably 40 to 50 pastors and church leaders, like staff maybe, who are giving like consistent, maybe even weekly, but at the very least monthly attention and kind of volunteer leadership to whatever part of Surge it's theirs. And all of that we're hoping now leads to more activation of laity. And that is one of the things where it's hard, because a lot of the work happening in cities is around church unity, which we are seeing incredible church unity. But it's really, for us, it's like, no, we want to see laity unleashed, activated, formed, and we have a role to help pastors and leaders do that, church leaders do that. And then also it's like, because there is a decentralized component, but we're always coming back together in these monthly and quarterly rhythms for prayer, discernment. How do we make these decisions around pursuing different funding and where it should go when it comes? So a lot of that work has just been this beautiful community of probably 8 to 15 people who've given a lot of time and attention to that, to where it's like, when people are looking in, like, how do you do that? And like, wow, the leadership, it's like, there is definitely leadership being given to it, but it's whatever you're grabbing and noticing likely was designed and created by someone other than who's getting, the couple of us who get credit for it.
Right.
It's just this beautiful community that's growing up out of this. I would say 2016, probably going back to 2014 but 2014 to 2016, we really emphasized wanting to be multi-ethnic, multicultural, and to put at the center of our leadership African American, Latino leaders, very explicitly formed female leaders. So that's been this other component that I think has just been really beautiful to see, a lot of intentionality around centering, putting at the center parts of the church that have often been the last at the table when we do these citywide conversations, and then trying to reshape our structure to really support those leaders, as opposed to asking those leaders to come into our existing thing and network. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun. It's got a whole life of its own, but it's a lot of fun to see God.
Well, and what would you want to say? And I know I've kept you for a long time, so we'll try and land here. Like, first of all, what would Dennae want to tell Dennae, like coming out of high school? There's no way that Dennae probably can see this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I imagine she isn't like, oh yeah, I can see a straight line from here to being a part of a city movement. Because what I also know is you're being humble, but you're being asked to help build and facilitate city movements like this all over the country, all over the world now, because you've gotten to be from the ground level and coordinate leaders. So there's a lot to talk about there, which we don't have time to talk about. But if you were just to talk to you, because there's any number of maybe young women, young leaders, if they listen to you and they imagine in my city, if there were like 120 pastors that were committed in clusters around initiatives and bringing in the marginalized and having theological training across denominations, this stuff all sounds like, who wouldn't want this?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that all is like great vision. But what I hear is in your story, how God was forming you to become the kind of person that could lead in this way. What would you want to tell you about, like, maybe either would have shortened your learning curve or helped you through some of the pain of it? What would you tell yourself?
Man, that's such a great question. I mean, there is this part of it that I think my first would just be like, take a deep breath, girl. Just chill.
Yeah, just relax.
Go see a movie. Have some fun.
Right.
But I do think there was the leadership table always felt like once I got out of high school, it always felt like there was 1,000 barriers between me and leadership. And wanting to lead, feeling called and gifted for it, until I had to fight my way to that table. And always feeling like as soon as I got there, I was like being kind of elbowed back out. And I think that there's this reality of what God was exposing in me in all of that time was like, there was pain and hardship, but it was for my good. So I don't want to replicate systems that exclude,
right? But
I also know that there's an element of pride and ego and need for that role and hunger. Like I noticed a hunger for power or decision-making or budgets or recognition that I would not have noticed had I not constantly been getting pushed out of it, you know?
Totally.
So I'm like, all of that path. And I just keep going back to like the most beautiful thing to me about Surge and Phoenix right now is the treasure that's being discovered in Christ and each other as we keep pressing into friendship. I'm so thankful for all the fruit that's coming out of it, but that is a fruit of friendship, and it would be as worth it if there was 5 of us as it is that it's getting to a scale that's being able to help others. But it's like God decides those things. I think I would have said there is just, I mean, this is going to sound so simple, but it's like the whole purpose of leadership is deeper discovery of Christ and our belovedness in him and the belovedness of those around us. And so there's just this, at each stage that God has kind of brought me to this wall where I feel stuck, or like I'm being suffocated in a system, or I'm going to like drown if I don't get out of this place.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's something that God has just been so gracious to like make the pearl of great price him, not the outcome of leadership,
Yes.
not the outcome of success or roles or recognition, to the point where, of course, I want women preaching and have freedom. And I'm going to do everything I can within my limits to help those pathways form and be easier for my daughters or whatever. But that's the joy of the work we get to do.
Yeah.
It's not really the purpose really is the friendship and the communion we get to have with each other as we go. And so I'm always like, at this point, the last couple of years, I'm like, I'm surrounded by brilliant people with great ideas, and I've got tons. I can think up an idea out of pumping gas, right? Like ideas, but it's just like, who can we go deep with together? And then what do we get to do out of the joy of our friendship together?
Yeah.
Like, that's all I want to do with this for the rest of my life, is like,
Amen.
Give me people who love Jesus and we enjoy each other, and then let's create out of that. And I feel like could not have seen at 19 or 25 or 30.
Right.
I couldn't have seen that the gift at this point, like it really has nothing to do with anything except these 15-year-long relationships that have been through hell and back. And you just see more of Christ and more of Christ in the other as you keep pressing in. And you hurt each other and forgive each other. And there's just something really, I don't know if that makes sense, but take a breath, see a movie. That's what I would have told
Yeah, see a movie. And what strikes me about your story, which is probably so present to you, you can't see it very easily, is at every step you faithfully did the thing that was in front of you. Like, you should not be the children's pastor and the youth pastor, number one. Then you're doing the Starbucks thing that kind of messes up the whole gig. And they can see it. So you're also like, I don't know, I'm just going to work within the constraints that are in front of me. And then other people will go, actually, you should probably do something else. Well, I don't know, maybe I'm going to Tanzania. I don't know. And then next year, you're like, nope, I'm not going to Tanzania. I guess, I guess they don't have women leading here, but I can probably just lead until they tell me I can't lead. And then, oh, there's a seminary thing I could do. Oh, I'm the only woman here. Well, nobody said I couldn't be here, so I guess I'll just do that until that's done. And then I'm leading in the thing where they're not convinced I should be leading until they say, maybe you should lead. And then I'm doing that. It's a very hard thing to manage that tension of, I don't think you think I can do this. But instead of either taking my ball and going home or spending all my time convincing you I should be able to do it, I think I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
and
then the humbling thing is I massively mess. That's the thing too. It's like my confidence to be able to do it.
Right.
And then I'm like, oh, wow, everyone else sucks at it too. But I'm like, I really suck.
Well, and
there is that like shaping of like, oh yeah, like.
And I can own that.
To do this well is actually way harder than what anyone is displaying it is. And good. It's like, it is also the good thing.
Well, and the work you're putting in to do that in the context of friendship. Yeah. As you're emphasizing, it's hard to do. Walking in and out of rooms as a professional or as a person, it's like, well, I guess I'm not included. Mm-hmm. It's hard to move past that to be like, well, I'm going to choose to care about you anyway. And let's see if in our familial connection to Christ, that changes over time. Yeah. That takes a lot of work, a lot of resiliency. That, I agree with you, changes you as a leader. Mm-hmm. The thing you need, you can't get until you're in the scenario that shapes you to be that kind of person. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the, I don't know if you've read Bolsinger's stuff on tempered resilience. His basic argument is the kind of leader you need to be, you don't become until you're leading.
It's good.
So like, it doesn't quite add up. Like it feels like a Yoda backwards saying, but it's just true. Like, how do you become this person? You do some things, but you're humble enough to be shaped while doing them.
I think that goes back to even like when you said the deconstructing question, because most of my peers, friends, family in that high school years ended up are very far from the church.
Right.
Or even what you're describing right now around you can't become that person until you're in that moment.
Right.
And the reality is for every one person who does become that person, 9 or maybe 90 don't. And I think there's this real, both when people, I think there's a lot of empathy for me, for those who've left the faith, for those who've left the faith and those who have gotten to this point and chosen to protect or to hoard as opposed to giving away, because I very much resonate with how terrifying it is to first feel like it took this long to get $10 and now I'm going to give it all away.
Yes.
And so I think that like just how huge, but that's also the thing that I think when you go back to like, but Christ, but what else is there? It's like, with the disciples, what else are you going to do but lean into this path of really dying to self, dying to ego, of all this death, because the only hope is Christ does resurrect and form this in us. And so I don't know if that connects in your mind, but it connects to me as you were talking.
It does.
Those are the two things that I think there's something that God does give you when you hit these really hard moments. And I think I'm so aware that it feels like in each of those moments, I was 10 seconds away from being on the other side. It was like really God's mercy and holding and pushing me or drawing me, depending on the situation,
yes,
into really like this, like obedience to Christ in this way is actually fruitful. And I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's costly.
Yeah.
But it bears fruit over time. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate making time to talk to me. And I would love to come back to you. We haven't done a lot on how city movements work. And of course, that's close to my heart. And I would hope the Vineyard could be the kinds of people that are connected with the larger body of Christ in their city. So that's something I'd love to spend some time talking about. So I'd love to come back and bother you to hear more about that.
Cool.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.